advantage of our current knowledge.
Exactly. And the discussion really crystallizes around a fundamental question about how we know things, especially when dealing with topics that powerful groups actively try to hide. The central question is this: is sticking rigidly to our traditional scientific and empirical methods enough when we're facing phenomena obscured by deliberate secrecy and profoundly subjective experiences?
Or, but in another way, do academic standards need to broaden out to somehow incorporate non-traditional, subjective, even covert data sources?
And I'll be arguing that yes, they do. My position is that our traditional scientific institutions are, frankly, compromised in significant ways. We therefore have to expand our framework, our epistemology, to include non-traditional evidence, look at historical patterns, and take subjective experience seriously if we want to grasp the full complexity of what's going on.
And I'll be taking a different tag. While I absolutely acknowledge the serious issues of secrecy and institutional failures, I'm going to argue that the core principles, empirical rigor, transparency, verification, these are essential. They are the guardrails protecting us from deception and error. So the focus, I believe, should be on reforming the institutions and demanding openness, not abandoning the fundamental methodologies that allow us to tell fact from fiction.
I respect that focus on reform, but isn't that perhaps a bit overly optimistic given the scale of institutional failure we've actually seen? I mean, can we really rely solely on systems that have repeatedly shown they're willing to suppress inconvenient truths?
Well, suppression is the problem, not the method used to find the truth.
But look at the evidence in the material. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, running interference for drug companies. Vioxx is the stark example. They ignored their own scientists' warning about massive risks, heart attacks, strokes. I mean, it was called the worst preventable drug disaster in history. That wasn't a scientific mistake. It was institutional choice prioritizing profit. Or the USDA sidelining inspectors who were flagging dangerous contamination. So when these structures designed for objective truth fail on basic safety, well, that's a deep legitimacy crisis.
But those are failures of implementation and oversight, not failures of the scientific principle itself.
But it forces us outside the mainstream framework. If the system is corruptible, why treat its methodological limits as sacred? We have extensive records of non-traditional phenomena, historical accounts of strange aerial events in Catholic archives going back centuries, to the 1200s even. And then there's the modern work, like Dr. John Mack's research. He studied people reporting intense, deeply consistent experiences with non-human intelligence and found them to be, quote, ordinary in every respect. Just dismissing this wealth of experience seems like, well, intellectual corruption. Reality's complexity, these individualized expressions of common forces, demand more than purely materialist science offers.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The entire history of reliable knowledge is built on open verification, on demanding evidence. That's specifically to guard against fabrication, bias, wishful thinking. We're not denying institutional corruption exists. We're arguing against throwing out the very tools that let us detect that corruption. Think about the Royal Society, the intellectual ancestors of modern science. Their motto was nullius in verba. Take no one's word for it. That demand for empirical proof, for testing, for replication, it's simply non-negotiable if we want shared, objective knowledge. If we start saying, okay, let's integrate subjective claims as standard evidence, we risk completely losing the guardrails. We lose the ability to differentiate between, a deeply felt anecdote and objective reality.
But what if the objective reality includes subjective experience as a key component?
That's where verification becomes crucial. And look at the covert data you mentioned. It's inherently untrustworthy. We know that classified entities like the Majestic 12 group operated on absolute secrecy and actively used disinformation. Intelligence agents spread fake stories about alien contact specifically to mislead researchers. So using covert, unverified data as a basis for a new methodology seems incredibly risky. The careful, sometimes slow conservatism of science when faced with extraordinary claims, that's often a strength. It demands higher proof because manipulation and error are so possible. Let's drill down on some of the evidence used for these subjective accounts. Hypnotic regression, for instance, often used with alleged abductees. What does the science actually say about that technique?
It's a tool to access memory.
Well, yes, but Dr. Herbert Spiegel, a real pioneer in hypnosis research, called it controlled imagination. His point was crucial. Hypnosis can intensify existing memories or even misperceptions of the original memory. So there's a serious risk we're just amplifying an initial distortion. The account might feel vivid subjectively, but its objective reliability is questionable. If the method of data collection itself is flawed, how can we build a new scientific approach on it?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it seems to just dismiss the sheer consistency across these accounts by labeling it imagination. You have researchers like Bud Hopkins who documented striking commonalities, hundreds of cases, worldwide. People reporting missing time, remarkably similar descriptions of procedures, of the craft involved. This consistency, it strongly suggests some kind of common external source or stimulus. It needs rigorous engagement, even if the trauma turns out to be primarily psychological or spiritual rather than purely physical abduction.
Consistency doesn't automatically equal external physical reality.
No, but listen, Dr. John Mack specifically studied these individuals and found them psychologically normal. Ordinary in every respect, no pre-existing pathologies. They weren't making things up wholesale. So just writing off their consistent reports as subjective distortion feels like a convenient, reductionist way to avoid grappling with a phenomenon that doesn't fit neatly into our materialist box. The question isn't just, can we measure it easily? It's, should our methods expand to encompass such a consistent pattern of human experience?
Yet, key figures who spent careers on this often landed on the need for objective standard. Take David Williamson, NASA's former point man for UFOs. He acknowledged the phenomena were, quote, very real since Ezekiel all the way to Florida, recognizing the historical depth. But his conclusion was critical. It's not a physical phenomena that you can measure. Keep an open mind and wait for physical evidence. So if the best interpretation from someone deep inside was that it defies physical measurement, what new objective metric are you proposing that isn't already part of traditional science? We risk swapping ambiguity for scientific chaos.
But the reason we often lack that physical evidence Williamson called for isn't necessarily because it's purely non-physical. It's often because of deliberate systemic suppression. We know from the source material about government disinformation agents, the aviary, whose job it was to feed fake, bizarre stories to journalists to discredit serious investigation. That shows an active systemic campaign to manage the narrative, to prevent physical evidence, or credible investigators from getting a fair hearing or even surviving publicly. The phenomenon might be hard to measure, yes, but the active prevention of measurement, that's a political reality that compromises traditional science from the get-go. You can't demand transparency when one side is actively manipulating the game.
Which brings us back to institutional behavior, but perhaps points to a different conclusion.
Exactly. Look at Majestic 12. It exemplifies how government structures what the material calls the Ouroboros operate, with operational closure, self-perpetuation. It's about power versus non-power. The institution's survival and secrecy trump scientific truth. It actively prevents public understanding. We saw that when Navy officials were basically ordered to keep quiet about unexplained aspects of James Forrestal's death. The system protects itself, not the truth.
Okay, but let's hold on. Arguing against reliance on leaked, covert data is crucial here, precisely because it was the rigorous empirical method that exposed the deception within that covert system. When researchers actually examined those supposed smoking gun MJ-12 documents, like the Cutler-Twining memo, they found major forensic problems: inconsistent typewriter fonts, weird date formats, misspellings, terminology errors that just didn't match military standards of the time.
Suggesting they were fakes, yes.
Right. Systematic forensic analysis, critical evaluation, that's what uncovered the likely hoax or manipulation. So this actually demonstrates the enduring power of the empirical method as our best defense against sophisticated deception. Why would we pivot away from the very method that successfully flagged the manipulation in the first place?
That's a compelling argument about the documents themselves, but have you considered, whether the MJ-12 papers were real hoaxes or not? The underlying systemic issue remains the same. institutional interests consistently override scientific warnings. The hoax just proves the existence of managed deception. The motivation for secrecy for operational closure is constant. Institutional self-interest blocking truth. We don't even need classified stuff to see this failure. Look at the lead up to 9/11. There were covert red team reports showing what a staggering 90% success rate smuggling mock weapons through airport security. But key officials chose not to act decisively on those warnings. Why? Not a scientific dispute. It was about avoiding costs, avoiding delays. The result? An entirely avoidable calamity. So this shows institutions overriding clear warnings regardless of classification or evidence quality. The institution itself becomes the methodology per se.
I have to reiterate, though, the systemic problems you're highlighting. Within science, the intense focus on visible metrics, the relentless chase for grant money that can overshadow pure curiosity, academic risk aversion, these things demand internal reform, better structures, more accountability. You're pointing to political corruption, financial motives, institutional inertia, and then claiming the answer is to bake unverified subjective experience into our core scientific methods. That feels like a leap, a non sequitur. Surely the goal should be restoring transparency and rigor within academia, fixing those flaws, not tossing out the bedrock principle of objective verification.
But the push to expand the framework comes precisely because those reductionist models keep failing to account for the full spectrum of reality, including these documented phenomena. We need to re-examine history, different traditions, think about indigenous knowledge systems mentioned, or the work on pre-verbal language by groups like the Modern Invisible College. These offer worldviews where the sharp human nature divide so central to Western materialist science just doesn't exist in the same way. Our current paradigm, which often treats consciousness as secondary, maybe even accidental, seems inherently ill-equipped for these deeply complex, persistent, subjective experiences. We need a broader epistemological toolkit to even begin to accommodate this complexity. So, to summarize my view, the way forward really requires moving beyond the limitations of an overly materialist science, a science that has shown itself to be risk-averse and, in key areas, institutionally compromised. The evidence we have of deliberate suppression, coupled with the sheer consistency and, importantly, the non-pathological nature of so much subjective experience testimony, it demands a broader, more inclusive framework for seeking knowledge. Complexity simply requires multiple perspectives, especially when the narrow empirical view is being actively defended or even weaponized by institutional interests.
And to wrap up my perspective, while the suppression of truth, whether through government secrecy or institutional failure, is undoubtedly a grave societal problem demanding our full attention, the solution can't be to abandon the only reliable mechanism humanity has painstakingly developed to differentiate objective reality from error, bias, and outright manipulation. That mechanism is the empirical, verifiable, transparent scientific method. The fight, therefore, must be for more transparency, for reform within the established framework. We need to demand that institutions uphold their scientific and ethical duties rather than taking a speculative leap into domains where verification becomes fundamentally impossible or meaningful.
And this tension, this pull between maintaining rigorous established standards and finding ways to accept and integrate complex, often deliberately obscured data, that really is the key challenge. It's central for anyone trying to understand the true shape of our world, especially when powerful forces are actively managing what information sees the light of day.
Indeed. And how we navigate that challenge, how we choose to adapt or reinforce our methods, will undoubtedly continue to shape inquiry in these difficult fields.